All right. Hello, everyone. So, welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie. You might recognize me from our Lake Forest Park location. I am your host for this evening, and I am so excited to be introducing Victor Manibo and Elijah Kinch Spector here to discuss Elijah's book, Kalyna the Soothsayer, which just came out yesterday. So I hope you'll all join me in wishing him a happy book birthday. So before we get into the good stuff, on behalf of all of us here at Third Place Books, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. For those of you who may not know, we are an independent bookstore with 3 locations in the Seattle area. We're having more and more of our events in person, which is very exciting. But our online events program is sticking around to connect readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and of course for buying books. Your support is what makes all of this possible. So if you haven't gotten your hands on any of the books that come up this evening and you would like to, I will be linking books in chat. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in, grab a copy off the shelf, or you can place online orders and come pick them up in the store. Or if you're not local or not leaving the house, we of course ship. So go ahead and follow those links in chat over to our website. And while you're over on the website, I definitely encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Check out some of our other upcoming events. The newsletter is just a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our book clubs, and of course you can follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. And we have a pretty good time on our social media accounts, so it's worth checking them out just to see if there's anything there for you. So tonight we're here for about an hour, and towards the end we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be either at the top or bottom of your screen. It's different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. I absolutely invite you to share where you're tuning in from in chat right now. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure those end up in the Q&A so we can most easily find them. While you're in our chat and question spaces, I do want to remind you to please lead with kindness and refrain from any inappropriate behavior or harassment. And finally, should any technical issues arise, which can of course happen in the world of Zoom, we will resolve them as quickly as we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding. And all right, so now it's time for all of us to settle in, because without further ado, I am so pleased to welcome our authors. First, I'm going to introduce Victor Manibo, a speculative fiction writer whose work is influenced by his experiences as an immigration and civil rights lawyer. His book Sleepless is set in a world in which part of the population never has to sleep, and it follows a journalist as he investigates the murder of his boss, even as suspicion begins to fall on him. So K.M. Spara described it as an expertly crafted tale of exploitation and deceit set within the elder tour of a never-ending capitalist grind. And fondly said, "The Sleepless delivers on its premise. I could not close my eyes." So the second author is Elijah Kinch Spector, whose first novel just came out yesterday. Hooray! Kalyna the Soothsayer follows a plucky con artist who must pretend to see the future in order to protect the people she loves, and explores the way that power and politics are nothing more than stories that are sold as the truth. C.L. Clark said it is hilarious and heartbreaking by turns, and called it a reminder that if you can't see the future you want, sometimes you have to make it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the stage to our authors. Thank you all so much for being here. Audience members, if you need anything, don't be shy in the chat. I will be there. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage to our authors. So welcome.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Allie. That was such a nice introduction. Elijah, happy book birthday. Oh my God.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This is finally happening. Congratulations.
I know. After many delays.
After quite a few delays, and now the book is out. I'm very, very happy for you. We've talked about this book quite a lot already, and I'm just so pleased that your day has finally come. My book came out a month and a few weeks ago. I know what the experience is like and how exhilarating it is to debut. How has it been for you so far?
Well, I mean, it's been interesting because, as I mentioned, the book got pushed back a few times due to, supply chain issues. So like I sort of kept having the like, oh, my book's about to come out feelings, and then it didn't, which again was like not anybody's fault. It was just, supply chain COVID stuff this past year has been, obviously terrible. And so it was weirdly muted at first yesterday. It was sort of just like, oh, I guess that happened. And then as the day went on, it sort of got a little stronger. But then of course, not of course, but then I was offline from like sundown last night to sundown tonight because of Yom Kippur. So then I sort of like signed back in a couple hours ago and was like, oh, there's stuff. That's very exciting. So it's been a whirlwind for sure, but it's sort of been stop and start. Yeah, I don't know. But on the other hand, it's like, I have to, sometimes you get so into thinking about the book that you have to take a minute to step back and go, oh, I've just achieved a lifelong goal.
Right. It is easy to kind of forget that in the lead up to things.
Right.
But I'm
Yeah,
glad
really.
that you're like, really getting the full experience now. My date also got me, so I definitely hear you when you say like, oh, there's this stop and start like aspect to
Yeah.
it. But now you're a debut author, a lifelong
Yeah.
dream, as you're saying.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk about all that. We're gonna talk about this journey and this book. But before we get into all the good stuff, there might be folks here who aren't familiar yet or not too familiar with Kalyna the Soothsayer. So in your own words, I want you to, get into it. Tell us what the book is about. Basically pitch us on like this awesome, personally, I love it, fantasy book.
Yeah, it's excuse me. It's secondary world fantasy in a setting that is vaguely Eastern and Central European inspired, and kind of 18th century. I sort of wanted to move away from the sort of the Middle Ages are a great setting for a lot of things, but I sort of wanted to move away from that sort of thing. And we'll probably talk about this later, but I find the sort of 18th 19th century much more interesting in terms of weird governmental experiments, which is partly what the book is about, because it's set in this country that is this bizarre amalgamation of 4 different kingdoms that doesn't really make sense or work, because there have been times in history where people are just trying things like that. And so that's sort of the general setting that I thought was kind of fun to explore. But then as Ali said, the main character, Kalyna, is she's from a line of soothsayers and people who can see the future, actually see the future, actually see visions of the future, and she can't. She just can't. And so she's a con artist and also has a very low opinion of herself. And so a lot of it is also sort of about the tension of not living up to family expectations. I've realized after the fact that it's also about not being neurotypical. And it's sort of this about putting this character who is kind of the lowest of the low in her society, because she's a nomad who is ethnically ambiguous to everybody she sees, and so is seen as othered and foreign by everybody, and putting her into this situation where suddenly it's this complex court intrigue ridiculousness that she recognizes as ridiculous, but also is very dangerous. And I think I tried to walk a line of having it be fun and adventurous and also have some real things to say. Yeah, that was very rambling.
No, it's good, and that's really what I like about a lot of epic fantasy, secondary world fantasy, and your book is that in the center there is a really affecting story. It's a lot about family, but also it has a lot to say about state building, and you have all the fun spycraft and court intrigue, and they're just all like melt together really well, and that's something that I'm like, oh yes, this is perfect, this is amazing. And I always think, because I personally do not write fantasy, although I do want to, I just feel like it's
You
so
should.
hard. because there are so many elements, there's so many, like, moving pieces, and I'm wondering, with this book, which came to you first? Is it the world? Is it Tetrarchia? Is it Kalyna? Is it just a premise of, like, this person who is kind of an outcast within her family, and like with their place in society? Where did the story come from? What was the first thing that came to mind when you said, like, I'm gonna make a book?
It really started with Kalyna, specifically with the idea of, wow, it would suck to be from this family who all have this power and you just don't. Like, that was literally the starting point, and everything else came from that. And like, it's not that writing fantasy is easy exactly, because certainly there have been times where I was tearing my hair out, but I will say I did not do the, like, sit down and plan out the world ahead of time thing. Like, that's not how I write at all. Like, the world building happened as I wrote the book, kind of around the character and around the ideas that were already in my head at the time. And I think what fantasy allows you to do when you're creating, doing secondary world fantasy, is it allows you to sort of just, whatever weird shit you've been thinking about lately, whatever things about how the world works or how people work that have been in your head, you can kind of just find ways to put them in there, because you're completely making up the world from scratch, from from the ground up. And so a lot of the world building, like, I don't think, like, I write in order. Like, I started writing at the beginning of the book, and I finished at the end. Like, I don't jump ahead or jump back, really. So, like, literally the Tetrarchia, the country that it's set in, the chapter in the book that describes what it is probably when I figured out what it was. Like I really didn't have that planned out. It's just like, I'm thinking as I'm writing, like, what is this place? And then when I hit upon it, I was like, well, now I'm going to have a chapter that explains what it is. So really a lot of it did form around her, and around, like, just what was in my head at the time, and things that are always on my mind about nations and ethno states and other not fun, but to me very interesting things to think about.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we've talked before. I don't think I knew that you wrote it sequentially. So, like, things come up and then you put it in the book. I also know that you started this book a while back. So what was that process like, in terms of, like, building on this story? From what I remember, it was 10 years ago. Like, you must have changed as an author, and therefore the story changes. Talk to me a little bit about that process.
Yeah, no, I almost exactly 10 years ago, I have a note of the very first thing I wrote for the book, which is basically a version of the opening scene of the book, and it's from November of 2012. So we're at almost exactly a decade, as a
Yeah.
matter of fact, which is wild. But it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that it took 10 years to write the book. Like, I think I had a I had a complete first draft in, I think, 2014, and then, like, and then I think I did some more work with friends, sent it to agents, took some time off, sent it back to agents, so it's this long sort of process. But I'm glad in some ways that it did take so long, because I do feel like a lot of ways that I have changed as a person. I think when I was writing it, I was still vaguely figuring out a lot of my ideas around things like national identity, things like the politics of big, divided, ridiculous countries like the one we're in, for example. I was still, I think, figuring some of that out, and, like, frankly, in that time in between, I got much more politically radicalized, let's say, much
Yeah,
more
no,
let's say
say it,
much more
radicalized.
leftist.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
that's perfect.
um, like, I started writing it in the Obama years, and as time went on, my own feelings about this, not that the book is about this country, but it's like an old kind of cliche that any piece of fiction, no matter when or where it's set, is kind of about the time and place where it's written, right? And so certainly that a lot of that's there. And I think that a lot of the political ideas that were in the book came together much better a few years later, when I had a more sort of grounded idea of my own politics and ideas. Also, it's interesting, just in terms of how long it's been, that when the book was announced, I remember the official announcement referred to Kalyna as young, and I was like, she's not young, she's my age. Oh shit, she was my age when I started the book. Now it's been a decade.
Yeah.
So, or, like, I think she was a couple years younger than I was at the time, but, like, late 20s. I was like, oh, late 20s isn't, oh god, wait, yes it is.
And yeah, I mean, you changed, the stories changed, the world around you changed, and that affected, what got onto the page. And I think that's such an interesting dynamic, especially when you're dealing with a book that talks about nations and nation building and how governments are run. So I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. Let's give our viewers a little bit of a backgrounder about Tetrarchia, and you pronounce it differently from me, I think, but
It's all made
we-
up. Don't worry about it.
right, yeah, because as you already alluded to, this is kind of like a political experiment, right? And there's an uneasy coalition of these four kingdoms. I want to know what well, give our viewers a little bit of a setup, and also what made you want to tackle geopolitics in a fantasy work, and how did you come up with this setup, with this kind of system of government?
Yeah, so the Tetrarchia, it is four different kingdoms that were all their own countries that all became one country, but they still have their borders are open, but they still each one still has their own official language and their own official money and their own cultures. But of course, as is made clear many times in the book, one kingdom doesn't have one culture. Really, it has 100 different little cultures because that's the way the world works. And I think this was on my mind a lot at the time. I mean, I don't know that I wanted to write about geopolitics exactly. I think that I just that shit is just in my mind to such a degree that I couldn't not. And especially in 2013, I read this amazing book called Vanished Kingdoms by, oh my God, Robertson Davies, I think is his name. I have an essay coming out about it later this week, I think. So there'll be more of my thoughts on it there, but it's called it's like a history of forgotten Europe. And so it's all about countries in Europe that don't exist anymore. And so much of the sort of point of the book and the larger thesis of the book is that our ideas around national boundaries and national characters are so modern and so fake, because there were, we think, oh, everybody within this boundary on the map is French, but however many 100 years ago, a lot of those people were in Burgundy, or one of the many different countries that was called Burgundy at different points. And so that was very much in my head, this thought about borders and national character and all these things being really mutable and much more mutable than we'd like to think. And that is, I think, for me personally, something that's always been on my mind to some degree, because I'm an Ashkenazi Jew. And so like my ancestors spent centuries being kicked around different parts of Eastern Europe and not officially belonging to any of them, right? It's just it's just kind of ingrained in me, this idea that like national identity is a thing that exists that I don't get to be part of, usually, historically. And so I think that was always in my head. I also read this book called With Fire and Sword, which is it's like a historical novel. It's from 19th century. It was written in the 19th century. It's set in the 16th century, I think. It's a Polish novel, and it has some of its own bad nationalistic stuff in it because it's a 19th century novel. But it talks a lot about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was literally Polish and Lithuania becoming one country that had one king, but the king was elected by the nobles. It was a weirder setup than what's in my book, actually. But
Yeah.
like that in my head, I think was also part of it, of just like, there've been a lot of weird countries. Like fantasy so often, again, it's not all medieval fantasy, and there's a lot of interesting things to explore in medieval times, but we get this idea that in history, countries were like, oh, they have the king and he has his fortress, and then this place is his country. And you look at like the 18th and 19th centuries, and they get so much stranger and so much weirder, and there are all these bizarre experiments, including again the US, right? That I wanted to, and again, I never sat down and went, I want to think about these things, but they were clearly write about these things, but they were in my head a lot, and so that just kind of came out in it, I guess.
And so like I'm hearing these books and these ideas, and I'm like, were you just reading that for fun? Is this your idea
Yes,
of
yes,
leisure reading, or was it
I have a
research for the
broken
book?
brain.
No, I think that's great. I think that's brilliant. I think, it's more elevated than what I read, but to each his own. I think that's
That's not
great.
the only thing I read. To be,
I'm
I
sure.
also read,
Uh,
but
but
yeah,
yeah, that's great. I think again, the geopolitics is something that I am very interested in, and especially just the very tedious project of like creating a nation and bringing people together is always ripe with like conflict, right? So because you mentioned it a little bit, your Jewish heritage, right? And where you're just coming off of Yom Kippur fast. I know that this book is influenced by your heritage as a Jewish man. I want you to talk a little bit about that and how that influenced Kalyna, the book, and the character. I know that religion isn't too at the forefront of this story, but there
right.
is a Jewish sensibility to this book. And
That's
maybe
yes.
maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, that religion isn't something I decided to tackle too much in this book, but the thing about Jewishness is that it's religion and it's culture and it's a lot of different things at once. I mean, the obvious thing, the obvious ways that the book's very Jewish is that it is, again, it's, and not just Jewish, I should say Ashkenazi Jewish specifically, is that it's set in this very kind of Central and Eastern European setting. Which is obviously like where my family is from and where, Ashkenazi Jews, which is to say the Jews that are considered to be white people in this country are from. And so that was certainly part of it, and more specifically the fact that Kalyna is of the place that she is from. She is from the Tetrarchia. She is in fact more from the Tetrarchia than a lot of people, because her background has people from all parts of it in it, but she is considered to be an outcast, like, by the people there. That was very much sort of based, I think, in that sort of history of being from these places, being extremely from these places, but not being from these places according to the people that run them, right? So that's definitely a big part of it. But I think also just, so on a more basic level, I think just I mean, the tone of it, the sort of sardonic tone of it, to me at least, very much fits a sort of Jewish mold of sort of laughing at awful things because what else are you supposed to do, like that sort of thing. And then also the sort of just immediate suspicion of any ethno-nationalist ideas, and of any, which is a very diasporic Jewish thing specifically, obviously, but that's who I am. This sort of just a sort of a cynicism about the idea that this big weird nation will continue to exist, but also that doesn't have to mean that everything is doomed either. Just sort of like things will go on. Like, I think the Jewish view of things a lot of times, at least for me, is a very long one. And so it's like, yeah, things come and go, and these places might crumble, and that might be bad, but also like things keep going. It's all kind of a cycle, is sort of how I often look at it. That was sort of, that went in some circles, but it's hard to say sometimes because it's such an important part of who I am. Like I often say it's maybe the most important identifier for me, like beyond gender, sexuality, being a writer, like anything. I think it's like the number one thing that is the most important to my identity. So it's hard even sometimes to judge how much it's affecting ideas in the book. But also, actually, one last thing, which I just remembered, which is there's a character in the book which is her grandmother, who is the worst person ever. Grandmother's fucking terrible. She's absolutely terrible. She just treats Kalyna like shit for the entire book. That is not based on anyone in my family or on any particular Jewish thing specifically. However, I realized after the fact that what it is it's sort of the idea of the immigrant parent or the Jewish parent who has really, really high expectations for you and you fail at them, just taken to its most extreme, ridiculous kind of version. So that's another thing that I think was definitely influenced by that. Although again, not like anyone in my family, but like a huge exaggeration.
No, absolutely. And here's the thing that I'm learning. You can say as many disclaimers as you want, your friends and family are always going to think, oh, this character is based on me, isn't it?
Oh God, it only just came out, so I don't know yet how much of that I'm gonna get, but we'll see. We'll see. Some very nice things about my family in the acknowledgments. So
Well, that's good. So going back to what you're talking about, about how you're being a Jewish person. It's your most important identifier. Just infuses the work even without you intending it. And I think like that's also one of the things that I really liked about this is because the culture is there, but it's not surface. It's about an outlook. It's about the sense of humor. It's not about clothes or food or like the obvious visual signifiers. Those are important too, but you really really dig deep. And one of the, I think, really biggest parts of, I think, the Jewish sensibility of this book that I felt. I'm not Jewish myself, but
you live in New
I
York.
yes, exactly. I was just gonna say that, but like I'm in New York.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the family dynamics. You already mentioned grandma. This is a very relatable character, not just the Jewish grandma, but just a grandma in general who, as you were saying, is from an immigrant family who is very like determined, and has a particular way of doing things. This is very relatable to me as an Asian, as an immigrant. I have these kinds of people in my life. So I want you to talk a little bit more about the family dynamics, specifically, and how you crafted that, how you fleshed out these characters, particularly grandma and Kalyna's father. I think those are the most important relationships.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, it's funny with grandmother. Like, I truly, when I started it, I wasn't thinking about any of like what she might represent, or I truly just it is fun to write a mean character. Like, it's fun to write a really mean character. It just is. So that was definitely part of it. And then also, it was a way to give Kalyna somebody to push back against early in the book, to get, essentially an antagonist. Like, she's not, grandmother's kind of the villain of the book. Like, she's not the official villain, but she's the villain you can't just like stab and like you're done, you know? So that was at the beginning, it was really just that. And then I think it over time sort of bloomed into, Kalyna deals with her own sort of low self-esteem, and more realizing like, oh, the ways that she talks about herself when she is very down on herself are essentially the kinds of things that her grandmother's been telling her all the time. And then, that's sort of leading into like, yeah, the way these sorts of family dynamics can work, where you feel like a loser, you feel like you're not good at anything, you feel this, that, or the other, and you realize, oh, that's so-and-so's voice in my head. Was definitely part of it. I think for her father, I think I just wanted to have somebody nice. He's like one of the only nice people in the book. He's not all there. He's actually very difficult for her to deal with in a lot of ways, which is also something we've all had to deal with. But because he's essentially in the book, he's been driven kind of crazy by having the power that he has, and so he's very sweet, but he's not all there. And I think I wanted to have somebody in the book who would be nice to her, but not make it too nice, because he's also kind of a burden on his own. And then it also ended up working very well because her grandmother really only cares about the son, her father, which kind of can lead to this sort of weird intergenerational thing where she hates the granddaughter, her granddaughter, because she doesn't feel she's taking good enough care of her father, and that sort of just, I think, just mining everything you can from that sort of experience is always going to be interesting. And yeah, I think just starting with her grandmother being terrible was like a really good way to go. I don't know.
I mean, interesting and very relatable, right? I think most people have difficult family members that they love, but also like, oh my God, why are you so horrible to me?
Right.
And it's always such an interesting dynamic to read about or watch. So but with grandma and with Kalina's dad, it does feel like she has so much to deal with. All right.
Mhm.
Like, and she is an outcast, an outsider in on several levels. And let's talk about that a little bit more. What was it like writing this character who, is different within her family, is different because of her family in the larger scheme of things? And how did you kind of bring about her personality? How did you kind of decide, oh my God, this is how she is going to react? So like, she's not like a wallflower. She is pretty
Right.
headstrong. So let's talk about Kalyna now. Let's get into our
Yeah.
title character finally.
It's funny. Like I don't usually like to say like, oh, the characters just appear and like talk to me, because I think that can elide a lot of real process that is involved. But I will say
Yeah.
that like that character pretty much came in from the first few lines that I wrote, and like who she was felt very clear immediately. And I think what it really is giving her so much to deal with, putting her as this outcast in so many different ways, who is in just such a bad position throughout the entire book, essentially let me sort of, I think she ends up having a lot of my worst worst qualities. Just like a lot of my worst misanthropy, a lot of my the worst examples of my arrogance, a lot of these things kind of just sort of go into her. And so it's also too pat to say that she's me, because she's obviously not, but every character has a bit of you in it. And it's, I think it was, yeah, her voice snapped into place pretty much immediately for me. It helped a lot that at the time I started the book, uh it was only a year or two earlier that I had had this amazing class on writing in the first person with Ed Park, who's a really great writer. And one of the books we read in that class was the book True Grit, which, a lot of people have seen, like the Coen Brothers movie, and there's a movie from the 60s, and those are both pretty good, but the book is just an all-time first-person narration book. Like, it's just so good in the way that the characters, the way that her narration tells you about who she is as she's telling the story, and who she was when the story happened, is just so perfect. And I think a lot of that was still like kind of in my head at the time, which helped. But yeah, it just sort of, I think it just sort of was a way of sort of, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, it just sort of came naturally with her, because I think I just thought of like how, how angry at the world would you be in this situation, and sort of built off of that, right?
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and, and she does get plenty angry in this book, for good
Mhm.
reason, right? Um, but another aspect of her that I really enjoyed, aside from her like really strong personality that comes through the voice, is the fact that she is basically a liar. And I mean, she's a con artist, right? And those are,
Yeah.
again, always fun to read, always fun to watch, because like she has to deceive and has to cover up things, but also, as the plot goes deeper, she also has to kind of untangle deceptions and plots around her. She gets swept up into court intrigue, and so there's a lot of layers of deception going on. And I want to know, what was that process like for you, writing a con artist, writing a character who, who lies, whose first instinct probably is to lie, around basically a snake pit of court intrigue where everybody has their own designs and schemes.
It was, it's very fun for me. I love to write that sort of character. I find that so much more interesting than writing somebody, like there are ways that it can be very fun to write a very kind of straightforward character, but I find somebody who's always trying to like get one over on people or fuck with them much more interesting. And so it sort of came naturally to do that. In terms of the larger plot, honestly, I mean, the thing is, part of it taking so long to write is that there are earlier drafts of it where the plot does not work. So like a lot of it has to do with like, my agent Hannah Bowman and my editor Sarah Guan, like over time, helping me to make the plot actually do something and work. But I think it's just, I think that it's always fun to watch that sort of character put in a situation where suddenly she's not even the worst person or the most dishonest person there, right? Like when she's in like court intrigue, it's like, well, I just lie to people a little bit and tell them what they want to hear and get some cash. These people are something else,
Like,
you
yeah.
know? And I think that sort of, you know, I mean, the thing about writing a con artist is that a con artist in real life is a terrible person, but in fiction can be a lot of fun because in fiction you can have them fucking with people that are above them instead of, you know, normal people who like are trying to buy a home or whatever. So, you know, I think that dichotomy it was just very kind of very fun to play with and a great way to sort of, you know, it's funny, I didn't set out to write any satire exactly. I was just kind of writing what was in my head. But as I was working on it with my editor, she was talking a lot about kind of the balance of satire versus the rest of the story, because I realized that there is a lot in there because you have this character who is, you know, been a liar her whole life, suddenly looking at rulers of countries and seeing how they operate. And so it ended up being a very good vehicle for satire as well. So long as the characters still felt, you know, like people.
Right. And you know, we do live in an age of where misinformation is so rampant, right? And you kind of see how in our broader institutions, wow, there's a lot of lying and myth making going on that like kind of just goes unremarked, or like even if it's remarked upon, it is able to carry on with very little consequences. So I guess like I never really thought about it as satire, but it is.
Yeah, I didn't either until my editor pointed it out. But
We have the same editor, and we can
yes,
both
it's
agree
great.
she's brilliant.
Yes. But yeah, no, I hadn't thought of it that way. But I think also part of it is, you know, it's, I mean, there's an old joke that people have like made forever in political satire in the US, which is like, oh, well, now things are so ridiculous, we can't even make satire anymore. And so it's like, it's on the one hand, it's kind of satire. On the other hand, it's not really that far off, right? Like the reality is usually pretty awful. That
No,
was a
no,
bad note to end on.
no. I mean, it is. You know, this conversation is gonna go where it goes, and it's hard not to comment on what's going on in the real world when we are talking about a book where, again, the functioning of government and the types of rulers that we have is such a central plot point in the story.
Right.
But to steer it away from all of that, let's talk a little bit more later about influences, because you know, I'm sure there were a lot of fantasy books. You've mentioned True Grit as like, you know,
Yeah.
something that you really hold as a touchstone for first person point of view, but like what about epic fantasy or secondary world fantasy? What are your major influences, or at least the ones that you really like and somehow affected the way you crafted your own novel?
Yeah, I think some big ones for me was I really love Stephen Brust, his Vlad Taltosh books, which are essentially, I don't know if you've read them, but you might actually like them a lot because they're essentially Dashiell Hammett first person detective stories, but in a fantasy world. So they might be right up your alley.
That
Also, I'm pretty sure Stephen Brust is like a Marxist, so they're pretty good in that
okay,
sense too.
sold, 100% sold.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I haven't read all of them yet because he wrote like 20 of them. I think there's still a few more coming, but he started in the 80s and it's still going. But like they're really good, and you know, what I love about those books is, you know, it's first person, and like I said, it's not just first person. It's like really Dashiell Hammett level first person, where it's like,
mm,
you know, I always think like the difference between like Dashiell Hammett and say like a Raymond Chandler is like Raymond Chandler has a lot, you know, when he was writing mysteries, it was very kind of, it was first person and sometimes kind of hard boiled, but also kind of like good prose. And Hammett is just
mm,
like, this happened and then this happened and then this happened. And
right.
having that in fantasy where there are 10,000-year-old elf people and like swords that kill people's souls, but it's being described that way is just so good. Um, and I think that was actually really good because like this idea of just like, oh, you can have the big epic fantasy stuff, but you can have it described in this very normal, down to earth way. I don't know that I exactly wrote it down to earth, but at least in a way that is not impressed, I guess. It was, I think, definitely an influence. I also really love Sofia Samatar's Stranger in Alondria is maybe my
Mhm.
favorite fantasy novel of the last 10, 15 years, whenever it came out. because it's just the sense of world building and the like kind of lush what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of tactile sense of the world is so good, and that really I think informed my world building because while there is a lot of politics, I'm generally not that interested in 1,000 years ago there was a battle that whatever. I'm much more interested in like what does the kitchen smell like? What are their clothes made out of? Like that, those sorts of tactile things matter a lot to me, and I think her book, that The Winged Histories was her second book, which is also very good, but I read it a little later. But Stranger in the Laundry, I think, was a very big influence because it's just the sense of that world is so visceral that you really feel like it's a place. And it's not because like it has a lot of history and that's really interesting, but it's also just because of the moment to moment like sensory details.
And I think this strong sensory detail does come through in your own work. I did feel like, oh, this place, these characters, everything has texture. Everything is just really layered. And so just my compliments to you. Well done. I mean, I've been showering you with compliments for the last 45 minutes. You know how
And
much
I'll take
I
it.
love your work. Yes, and you should enjoy it. It is debut month for you. So we are nearing the Q&A portion of the evening. I do want you to talk a little bit about what's next for you. What is in the horizon? I'm
Yes.
sure a lot of people are interested.
Yeah, so there is a sequel coming. I don't know the exact date, but there is a sequel. It's worth noting that Kalyna the Soothsayer, like the first book, has an ending. This isn't the kind of fantasy series where it, ends on a cliffhanger and the next book picks it up. Nothing against that, but that's not what this is. You could buy the first book and you can read it front to back, and it's a whole story. But I'm working on a sequel currently called Kalyna the Cutthroat. One kind of interesting thing that I decided to do was I decided I didn't want to write a second book in her point of view, so it's actually from a different character's point of view about her. So doing more of like a almost Holmes and Watson thing where the sort of side character is watching the person, and I thought that would be a fun new different way to do it because I thought writing more about I thought writing the same point of view for the same character, only a couple years later, it felt too repetitive to me, and both for the audience and also for me as a writer, it just like it didn't feel fun. So I thought it'd be more interesting to do that. It's also largely about utopian communism because I decided to stick with the like 18th and 19th century weird ideas. So
I think that's
I read a lot of Kropotkin in preparation for the second book, so we're gonna see how that goes. So that's what's next. I don't have anything beyond that at the moment. But,
I'm so excited. That sounds so exciting. And that title, man, like I'm sold.
I think I'll be honest. I think I came up with the title first.
Listen, you know what? The process is the process. Trust in it and just run with it.
Yeah.
And what's sequel writing like for you? How are you finding it different from this first go around?
I mean, it's a lot faster. I mean, I wish I was even faster at it than I have been, but 10 years versus less than a year is a pretty big difference. But on the other hand, it's good because I find that I'm not as likely to get kind of stuck on things. Like I think I'm the kind of writer who I can spend all day on a paragraph. I can obsess over something forever and not move forward. And having a deadline makes that a little less possible, which is good.
Yeah.
And I think also when I was doing revisions on Soothsayer by the end, and I was doing revisions with Sarah, I was like, there were some things where I was like, it had been there so long that the idea of changing it was like weird because it was set in stone. I'd written it a decade ago. I'd rewritten it 5 times, but it was still there. And that was like a larger block to get around. Whereas I think with this one, it'll be like, oh, I just wrote that. It's whatever. We can cut whatever. It's fine.
Yeah.
Also, I do remember at one point I got a note from her on Soothsayer that was like, what does this mean? I was like, I don't know. I wrote that 8 years ago. Let's just cut it. I don't care. So
listen,
it's been good.
My book was written, only a few years ago, and I don't even remember half of the things already. So I believe you when I say like this was 10 years ago. I'm like that was only a couple of years ago, but I don't remember.
Yeah. So at a certain point, it's a good I guess kill your darlings thing of just like I don't know, so cut it.
Yeah,
Who cares?
exactly. You don't have an attachment to it, and then hopefully you don't get to regret that decision later on and realize, oh, actually, I know now why I needed that one.
No, I don't think so. I've reread the book pretty recently, and I was like, wow, I'm actually really happy with this. Like, which is good.
That
So
is that is perfect. That is amazing. Um, all right. I think we can jump into questions now.
sure.
Hello, I'm back. So we have a question here. Audience members, there is space for more questions. So if you have any questions, we would absolutely love to hear them. Throw them in the Q&A or in chat. I will find them. So this anonymous attendee calls this a saving the world plot. What do you think makes for good stakes in an adventure story? And I would love to hear answers from both of you.
I mean, it's less a saving the world plot than a saving the country plot, I guess, if you want to get real technical. But I think that sort of those sort of stakes can be good, but I think that what's most important is how they actually relate to characters. Like I try in the book to have it less be about, oh no, the country could be destroyed, and more about like these people will be slaughtered and these people will be, you know, refugees and this, that, and the other, like to look at the human cost and the human element of it as I think more important than just like, oh no, because at a certain point, you know, we certainly get this with superhero stuff sometimes, and like I'm a old school comics fan, but at a certain point the universe is in danger doesn't even mean anything anymore, you know? So yeah.
Totally.
Well, for my book, The Sleepless, it is a little bit saving the world plot, and I think my approach to it was my book is near future sci-fi set in a world where half the or a quarter of the world doesn't need sleep, and there's a murder mystery, and I wanted my character to like have their own problem to solve apart from saving the world, and also on some level feel like I don't really care about saving the world, or like I have other concerns, but also, you know, in the end, because it is that kind of book, those goals kind of merge. So I guess this is my roundabout way of saying that good stakes in any save the world plot or adventure story always has to come down to who your character is and what's important to them. Like for some people, for some characters, saving the world might not be important. Maybe it's secondary or tertiary to mere survival, to I don't know, their romantic interests or their familial obligations, right? And if there's a way to weave in those very personal stakes with the larger you know, safety and security of the world at large, I think that's what is going to make the stakes really hit home and be more impactful.
Good answer. Thank you. So there is time for more questions, everyone. So go ahead and throw them in the Q&A. I'm going to give you a few minutes. In the meantime, though, I have a question. So Elijah, I know that you worked on this book for a long time, but is there a day that stands out to you as being your best writing day? And is there a day that stands out as being like the hardest one?
Oh God. Oh boy. Honestly, any day that would have been my best writing day is a day I probably do not remember now because I was in a fucking fugue state. Like I think I had a day a few weeks ago working on the sequel that was very good, but again, fugue state where I was just like, so I bought a physical typewriter recently. I bought a vintage typewriter from 1970 because I thought it would help me not go back and like tinker forever, and it did. So I also I have ADHD, and so I take Adderall, and so I had this day of just being on Adderall and also coffee and just typing on this fucking 1970 Remington typewriter for 12 hours. And it was I think it had been a long time since I'd ever written for that long at a stretch. Like I think it'd been over a decade probably. And that was really, really great. I don't know if any of it was any good. I have to look at it again.
Glorious.
Get it into Word, and I'm going to review it tomorrow. But that was pretty good.
Super solid answer. So I have a question here from Martin. If both of you and your publicist could go to the coolest place you know in New York City, where would that be? Also, your publicist is hi. Signed, your publicist.
Hi, Marty.
Oh my God, Allie, I thought you said also your publicist is high.
Oh, I just knew that.
I thought that's what I heard. Elijah, why don't you take this one first?
Boy, I mean, coolest place. That's hard to say. I mean, it depends on what you like, man. I mean, honestly, most of my favorite places in the city are like bars and bookstores. I don't know. Yeah, like I
Listen, like I know that Elijah, you like cocktails, you like drinking. I like cocktails as well. And you know, Marty always likes my Instagrams where I post cocktails all the time. So like we should just all pick a really cool place and just grab cocktails sometime.
Well, you know what's a really good one actually is the Up and Up. Have you been there? It's downtown Manhattan. Sorry, everybody, we're gonna have New York talk for a second. The Up and Up in downtown Manhattan. It's extremely good. Their cocktail list is like 4 pages, and every single one I've ever had there is very good. Strongly recommended. Very cool vibe. It's like downstairs. Love it. So that would be mine.
Perfect. Amazing. There's the Panorama. It's at the top of a hotel in Governor's Island that I've been meaning to check out. I've never been personally, but apparently the cocktails are great and the view is amazing because it's like on Governor's Island. You can see both Queens and the Manhattan skyline on both sides. And they also have Brennivin, which is this Icelandic kind of beverage that is kind of hard to find and also kind of nasty, but I really love it. So I've been wanting to go there for a while. So maybe you, me, and Marty can go sometime. There you go.
I've only been to Governor's Island once. I am down to go back. Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh, glorious. So this is the second question from Marty, and it says, on a serious note, the publishing journey is so surreal and convoluted and fun and odd. What has been your most surreal moment for each of you?
Oh boy. I mean, honestly, the most surreal for me probably was when my book first got announced, because like I've never published anything before, no short stories, no nothing. So it was very much like kind of out of nowhere for a lot of people, I think, because no one had heard of me. And also at the time I was in a day job that was going very badly. And so it was this very great, like kind of self-confidence moment of just like, this is amazing. Oh my God, this is happening. And I think that was very kind of surreal in its way. But also Worldcon was wild, but I don't remember a lot of it.
Same. Worldcon was a lot of fun for sure. It was surreal having authors who I admire be like, hey, you're Victor, right? I've heard about your book and like I'm so excited to read. I'm like, oh my God, how do you know my name? And thank you. That's so nice for you to say. I am in awe of you. And like, you know, we're just like fanboying with each other. Like that was amazing. Going to the National Book Festival was wild. You know, I did a panel and there were jumbotrons with my face on it, in the biggest book festival in the country. So like that's kind of wild and surreal, and I still can't quite believe that I was there. Thank you to Marty for setting that up and making that happen. But yeah,
I guess one other I could say is that just today I saw that I got a review on NPR, and I am from Berkeley, California, and I feel like you haven't made it in Berkeley, California unless NPR has done something about you.
Yes, so amazing. I saw the review and it was such a good review.
It was very positive. It was wild to see that on like NPR. So that, you know, coming from like a very kind of yeah, again, like Berkeley is a very sort of intellectual / hippy dippy place, and so like NPR is very much on everybody's wavelength there. So I'm just like this now. Now I'm a real writer to like my parents and my
Yeah,
parents' friends and stuff.
you definitely earned your cred. Congrats.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So we have time for, let's do one more question. If anybody else has questions, we'll reconsider the one more question rule. So throw those in the Q&A. But if not this genre, where would you like to explore? And I would like to hear from both of you.
I'm already doing a little bit of exploring. My current project is Gothic horror.
Ooh.
And so that's where my head is at. You know, creepy, vibey, all about aesthetics kind of thing. And I'm Filipino, so it's gonna be set in the Philippines. It's gonna be all about, you know, superstition and religion coming together or like overlapping and the amalgamation that Filipinos love, which is equally believing our folklore and, you know, Christianity and Catholic beliefs. So yeah, that's the vibe. I'm experimenting with it. Like I said, it's not what I've been writing, which has been sci-fi so far, but I'm really liking it and I hope it succeeds.
Oh yeah, that sounds amazing.
I was
Thank
also
you.
going to say Gothic horror.
I mean, it's great.
I mean,
Yeah.
can't go wrong.
Like, I mean, there are some horror elements in my book already for sure, and it's definitely something that I like a lot. I enjoy horror a lot. I didn't used to, and then in the last few years, my spouse basically got me into it, and now I really like it. So I definitely want to write some horror. I've written like a horror short story that I was pretty happy with, and might try to sell around at some point. I also like I do write science fiction as well, kind of on my own, that maybe at some point will be published. Although I am not good with science, so it is really more fantasy with a science fiction, you know, framework over it. But you know, I really, I mean, the nice thing about horror conceptually is that it can kind of go in any genre, right? Like it's like it's not exactly, it doesn't have to, you can write a science fiction or fantasy story that is also a horror story. And I just, those are aesthetics and feelings that I enjoy playing with very much. So yeah.
Totally. So cool. All righty, everyone. So we are pretty much at our time. So I think it's time to call it about a night. I'm going to just take this last moment to say a huge thank you to everyone who could join us this evening. For those of you who have not gotten hands on copies of Kalyna the Soothsayer or the Sleepless, I'm going to go ahead and relink those in chat so that they are findable. There are those. Let us know, audience, what you thought of this event in person or on social media. Of course, we always love to hear from you. Elijah and Victor, huge thank you. This has been so much fun. Is there any last minute thing you would like to say?
I have a website, ElijahKinchSpector.com. I have a newsletter you can sign up for there. That's all I got.
Yeah. And I am at Victor Manibo everywhere: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, even, and Twitter, of course, where I basically live. Yeah. Congratulations again, Elijah. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Don't go on Twitter.
I'm not on Twitter, so sign up for my newsletter.
Alrighty. So yeah, I linked everything, so it's easy to find. All right. So with that, I'm going to say one more huge thank you. And shall we do the awkward waving thing? Good night, everyone.
Bye.